speaker, Conrad. Thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight in this beautiful church. Of course, we're a bit sorry about the old regulations, but we will stick to all of them, and I hope you can also understand me. I'm not wearing a mask. I'm Conrad Valk, as you already said, and I'm the president of the introduction committee, and together with my colleagues, we organized this lecture today. And I'm really happy that tonight we're joined by Dr. John-Harmen Valk. He is an assistant professor and a university lecturer at the University of Leiden on the topic of religion and international relations. And in his own words, your research lies at the intersection of international relations, political theory, continental philosophy, and philosophy of religion. And in this evening's lecture, he will talk specifically about the 2017 ruling of the Supreme Court of Canada, which brought up issues with regard to the nature of secularity and also to the guide of religious freedom. And I will now give the word to Dr. Valk, and let us give him a warm round of applause as well. And welcome tonight.
Thank you. Very nice to be here and to have this opportunity to speak with you. I was saying earlier as I was talking with some of the board members, it certainly seems like this is a very active and engaged organized association, so it's great to see that, and it's great to be able to join in your slate of speakers this year. Before I get started, I just want to check, is the possibility of showing the video clip a go? Perfect, excellent. So I will give you directions then when to change slides and when to pull the video up. As Conrad just mentioned, I want to explore with you today a ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada from 2017, which concerned a case known as Ktunaxa Nation versus the province of British Columbia. This was a case before the Supreme Court that concerned the proposal to build a ski resort on land that is deemed sacred by the Ktunaxa peoples. The Ktunaxa peoples are an Indigenous group whose traditional lands span the Canada-US border in the west of Canada and the United States. So in looking at this court case, I want to explore some questions about the nature of secularity and also questions about the secular state's self-justifying claim to being a neutral guardian of religious freedom. I think this will be a topic that will be of interest to those with even broader interests. I'm thinking, for example, given that this is a UN student association, there may be some of you with interests in the rights of Indigenous peoples more broadly, right? So if you have interests in the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which itself has an article, a clause to do with religious freedom, I think there will be connections here. Likewise, if you have interest in the theme, say, of international religious freedom, which is a topic which has been on the agenda of a number of countries, certainly in the West in recent years, and this is a conversation happening in a variety of different foreign ministries. So connections on that front as well. In the talk, I want to make two interrelated claims. First of all, I want to suggest to you that the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling in this case characterizes religion in a very specific manner. That is to say, characterizes religion as belief. And in so doing, it exhibits a flavor, I would say, of a certain Protestant Christianity. And of course, the significance of this would be that the Supreme Court of Canada leverages a notion that it transposes from a particular religious heritage. The other claim that I want to raise is that the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling also holds a religion-like view of land. That view is of land as an object to be owned and to be manipulated. And I say it's religion-like because I think this is a view of land that fundamentally shapes the way that one might see the world. I think it's a view that is connected with a certain desire, in this case, a desire that motivates human action towards domination and control of the natural world. And it's religion-like, therefore, I think, because it's also a contestable characterization. So that's to say it's not one that can be proved in any sort of foolproof way. So otherwise stated, the ruling of the Supreme Court is one that, on the one hand, constitutes religion as something, as belief in this case, and simultaneously creates an allegedly non-religious sphere, that is the political, by a claim to what land really is, in this case something to be owned. So it creates this non-religious sphere, the political, by making a religion-like claim about the world and human's place in it. And both of these points then that I want to raise for you this evening raise questions about the character of the secular state and its self-justifying claim to being that neutral guardian of religious freedom. I'm going to ask you to switch to the slide, the next one. So having said that, in the time that remains, I want to accomplish a number of things. First of all, I want to give you an overview of this case, Ktunaxa Nation versus the province of British Columbia. Then I want to speak a bit about the appeal by the Ktunaxa peoples to the Supreme Court. I then want to look at the ruling of the Supreme Court, and we'll look both at the majority decision and the minority decision. In this case, as in other cases before the Supreme Court, sometimes there are slight differences of opinion. So we'll look at the opinion of the majority and the opinion of the minority. We'll then look at the Ktunaxa's position in comparison to that, and then I'll close with a few more general remarks about these questions of the nature of the secular state. So, what is this case, Ktunaxa Nation versus the province of British Columbia, about? Well, it concerns a proposal that was put forward by a developer, a consortium actually of different interests, who wanted to build a ski resort in the mountains in the west of Canada. Can I ask you to move to the next slide? You can see on the slide here a map of Canada. On the west, so that's on your left, is the province of British Columbia, the province to the farthest to the west, all right? And the proposal for the ski resort is in the mountains in that province of British Columbia. You can switch to the next slide. In this slide, you can see superimposed on the map then the traditional lands of the Ktunaxa people as it spans the border between Canada and the United States. So this developer wanted to build a ski resort in this area, and it had identified a specific place called Jumbo Mountain, or at least in English referred to as Jumbo Mountain, and the Jumbo Valley beneath it as access to that mountain. The developer thought this was a prime location for a ski resort because it offered access to 4 large glaciers in the area, offered great views of the surrounding region, gave the possibility of year-round skiing because of glaciers there. The village that the developer proposed to build would have an imprint of roughly a square kilometer in this Jumbo Valley. And this was the case because the developer envisioned having a volume in the vicinity of 2,000 to 3,000 people per day in the high season coming to this area. Now, Jumbo Valley has always been a site of heli-skiing, okay, skiing by helicopter. But this resort would be the first time that there would be a permanent presence of buildings in the area. The developer first submitted plans for this year-round ski resort in 1991, and it was met with opposition by a number of different groups. Among those, backcountry skiing enthusiasts, environmentalists, and then also the Ktunaxa peoples, whose traditional lands include the Jumbo Valley. I want to focus specifically then on the dimension of the Ktunaxa peoples. Can I ask you to show now the video clip? I want to show you a video clip which was put together by Patagonia. If you're an outdoor enthusiast, you may have heard of that company before. It's a video which is certainly crafted from the perspective of outdoorsy people. Okay, so I think it does give that sort of angle to the issue. But it nonetheless gives you an idea of this particular area. Okay, it gives you an idea of the land. So take a look at that, and then I'll continue once we've seen this short clip.
This is an opportunity opportunity to develop an iconic all-seasons resort. There will be nothing like this in North America. There is nothing like this in North America. When you go up to the top of Jumbo Mountain and you look down into Lake of the Hanging Glaciers, I guarantee, Honourable Speaker, people are going to come from around the world. This is going to help lay a foundation for the growth of our tourism industry here in British Columbia.
Every measure of public opinion in the Columbia Valley for the past 20 years has made it clear that people who know that project the best have been against it. Does the minister seriously think the people in the Kootenays are going to quietly sit by while he attempts to impose a development in Jumbo Valley?
The controversy in the Jumbo Valley has been going on for 24 years. On one side, you've got Alberto Berti, his partner Grant Costello, and some members of the government who support the development. And on the other, you've got environmental advocates, other members of the government, and a few thousand locals, including a First Nations that has lived on that land for almost 10,000 years, who all want to see that land kept wild.
In the midst of Jumbo, you feel like a really small person. When you tune into that silence, you become part of the landscape. It's like a part of you is waking up with nature. When I was around 14, my parents took me up to Jumbo. I just remember looking across this lake and my dad telling me, you have to protect this place someday. I feel like it's a huge responsibility as a skier because the mountains can't talk. And once there's infrastructure in them, it's never going to go away.
Our land is pretty rich in the wilderness. And on this program, our guest is going to show us just what can be had, free at hand, from the wilderness.
The Jumbo Valley is in a pocket of British Columbia that's a long way from nowhere, between Vancouver and Calgary, the Rockies and the sea of mountains that run in every direction towards Montana, Alaska, and the Pacific Ocean. It sits at the very headwaters of the Columbia River. In 1991, Alberti submitted his first formal proposal for Jumbo Glacier Resort. By 2004, thousands of locals marched on the streets of Nelson. Despite the fact that 90% of the feedback was against the development, the government approved Jumbo Glacier Resort's environmental review only months later.
We got ski hills, we've got golf courses coming out our ears in this valley. How many do we need?
Our society is being robbed of the opportunity to make real our aspirations, that human beings could be able to make a reasonable and decent living without destroying other species.
Generally, ski areas aren't necessarily bad for bears, but the Jumbo Resort is located right in the center of that 4-acre area. To develop and fracture that is my biggest concern.
Bears are attracted to human food and end up being killed, and that's the fragmenting force.
In 1920, there was 35 small populations scattered across the U.S. By 1970, they were all gone. We're trying to solve the problem. I think society should look hard at creating more of that problem.
The Ktunaxa people have been here in this valley 9,000 years. That's 400 generations. The Ktunaxa people have been here for that arc of time. What we're talking about is a sacred space in which they want to literally dump village. I wouldn't even get through the gates if I was to show up at the Vatican with plans for a resort. Preposterous, right? We're the ones that have to prove our rights to the land. It's ridiculous, right? If we say that the space is sacred or a place is sacred within the boundaries of our territory, we should be able to say no, and our no should be heard.
Jumbo is so emblematic of the larger questions facing our society. We've run out of the frontier. This is the end of it. And this is where it stops. And now this is where we have to make those difficult decisions about, do we squeeze those last drops of resources, of opportunity, of commercial interests out of that remaining frontier and leave ourselves with nothing? Or do we protect that frontier because it's part of this natural world we've inherited, and we owe it to more than just ourselves to protect that frontier?
If people could only see the world back there, they'd want to protect it too.
So, hopefully that video has given you a bit of a taste for this particular area that I'm speaking about. Certainly if we're talking about land, if we're talking about place, I think it's good to have an idea, a sense for that. Like I said, this is a video that was created by Patagonia, an outdoor company, so I think it does get a certain angle on the issue. I want to focus more specifically on the concerns of the Ktunaxa people with respect to this proposed development in the Jumbo Valley. So what's the issue here, right? Well, as you would have seen in this video, the Jumbo Valley, or as it's referred to by the Ktunaxa people, Ktunaxa, is part of the Ktunaxa's traditional land. And more importantly, Ktunaxa is significant because it is connected with a key spirit in the cosmology of the Ktunaxa peoples. What do I mean by that? Well, in the Ktunaxa cosmology, there is a spirit, which in English would be referred to as the grizzly bear spirit, which is a key spirit in their spiritual system. And this particular spirit is understood by the Ktunaxa peoples to have been born in this area, in Ktunaxa. This is an area as well, which according to the Ktunaxa peoples is where the spirit returns to heal itself. It's the place where the spirit enters the world and the place from which it returns back into the spirit worlds. And according to the Ktunaxa peoples, if permanent buildings were to be built in this area, Ktunaxa, this would lead to the permanent departure, the disappearance of the grizzly bear spirit. Now for the Ktunaxa peoples, they draw guidance, they draw strength, they draw protection, they draw their spiritual system from this spirit. They understand the spirit as well to be one which is key because it relays prayers from their part then to the Creator. According to an oral tradition in the Ktunaxa people's history, there is an oral tradition about the Creator requesting that the grizzly bear spirit make space for humans to inhabit the world. And so according to this oral tradition, then, the grizzly bear spirit agreed to withdraw them into the mountains to create a space in which humans could live and flourish. And as a result, stemming from this oral tradition, then the Ktunaxa peoples understand themselves as having a certain obligation or a covenant, that is an obligation or a covenant on the part of humans to respect this spirit because of what it did for humans, to respect it through song, through dance, through prayer, and also to act as stewards of the land. So to take care, to steward the land that they have been entrusted with. So that's the significance of Ktunaxa, this place, in so much as it is connected with this grizzly bear spirit in the cosmology of the Ktunaxa peoples. Now, in 2010, the Ktunaxa peoples indicated officially through what was called the Ktunaxa Declaration, they officially indicated their opposition to this development. Now, nonetheless, 2 years later, in 2012, the government of the province of British Columbia okayed the developers' proposal, so gave permission for it to go ahead. And as a result, then the Ktunaxa peoples appealed that decision up through the court system until the case made its way to the Supreme Court of Canada. So I want to look at now the appeal of the Ktunaxa peoples in this case before the Supreme Court. Can I ask you to turn to the next slide? Perfect. So, one of the key dimensions of this appeal brought by the Ktunaxa peoples to the Supreme Court referred to a particular clause in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is part of the Canadian Constitution. And in specific, it was with respect to Section 2A in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which concerns the freedom of religion. Section 2A reads, in that charter, everyone has the following fundamental freedoms, A, freedom of conscience, and religion. So I want to explore the way in which the Ktunaxa peoples referred to this clause to make their case against the approval of the development in Gatmuk. So let's look at that appeal, and you can turn to the next slide. In their appeal, the Ktunaxa peoples attempt to give a certain understanding of what religion is, and by extension, that what is the purview of religious freedom, what falls under the category of religious freedom. One of the ways in which they attempted to go about this argument was to draw attention to the way in which, according to the Ktunaxa peoples, religious freedom should include within it protecting the Ktunaxa people's connection with the divine, right? In this case, with the grizzly bear spirit. So I have here on the screen a quotation taken from their appeal that gets at this point. I'll read it for you. It says, the Ktunaxa connection with the divine, here that aspect of the divine they know, relate to, and rely upon as grizzly bear spirit, is encompassed in what Section 2A is intended to protect. The proposed ski resort will effectively sever the Ktunaxa connection with grizzly bear spirit. So according to the Ktunaxa peoples, to have religious freedom entails to have this connection, right? To have this connection with the divine. And this connection can only be preserved, they argued, through the protection of Gatmuk, through the protection of this particular space understood by them as sacred. Because it is Gatmuk, this area, this place, that ensures the continued connection with the spirit and the Ktunaxa peoples. So one aspect, this idea of connection with the divine. You can go to the next slide. Another avenue of argument in the case for the Ktunaxa was to argue that religious freedom should also include a dimension of practice, and practice as forming or cultivating identity. Again, let me read you from their argument. The Aboriginal right claimed here was, in fact, to exercise spiritual practices which rely on a sacred space and require its protection. It is difficult to imagine what could be more integral to the Ktunaxa distinctive culture than their worldview, their system of beliefs and understandings of their physical and spiritual world, and the spiritual practices required to maintain their place in it. The Ktunaxa relationship to the grizzly bear spirit defines who they are as a people. So you can see an argument here about the idea that the identity, the very raison d'etre of the Ktunaxa peoples is understood to relate to this spirit. Right? Their spirituality is linked to this spirit, and the spirit in turn is linked to this place, Gatmuk. So their very identity, their very reason for being, their very spirituality is linked to this sacred site, to this land as sacred. So for them, to have religious freedom necessitates protecting this sacred land, because in order to be who they are, this space needs to be protected, right? And recall my mention of that old tradition where the Ktunaxa people understand the place of humans to be covenanted with the divine in a way that honors the divine through song, through dance, through prayer, and also to be stewards of the land, right? So to be the people who the Ktunaxa understand themselves to be necessitates protection of this land, and the very idea of themselves, the very identity, flows from it. Let me highlight another aspect of their appeal here in the attempt to broaden or make the case for an understanding of what religion is, and by extension, the nature of religious freedom. And you can move to the next slide. This is a statement by another Indigenous group in Canada, but who filed a document as part of this case as having intervener status, and I think it captures something about what's going on with the Ktunaxa people's argument. So this other group says, in the case of First Nation claimants whose spirituality depends on the existence of a sacred site, however, we are faced with a different kind of belief, in inverted commas. One that is not entirely internal, but that is inextricably connected to the sanctity of the site itself. In other words, the spiritual belief and the land are one and the same. So I think we see an argument here about an understanding of belief as being something which is an external relation. What do I mean by that? I think you might see here perhaps a slight contrast with, for example, an understanding in Protestant Christianity, where a site can, in a sense, be anywhere because God is not bound to a particular location. So in this sense, a different understanding, if you will, than what the Ktunaxa people are arguing, in arguing that the desecration of this land will lead to the disappearance wholesale of this grizzly bear spirit. Again, in contrast, say, to an understanding in certain forms of Protestant Christianity, God doesn't disappear, right, if a particular site is destroyed. So, according to the Ktunaxa peoples, one cannot simply isolate belief as something which is internally held within the individual. I think this is important, right? It's not something that can simply be detached from what it is connected to, right? The divine in this case, it can't be detached from the land in which this spirit dwells. So there's an argument here about a certain intersubjective relation, right? This is what I mean about the argument for an idea of belief as having an external relation, a lived connection in this form of belief. And this external connection, of course, as I said, being only possible with a connection to this land, to this place. So, three different forms of this argument by the Ktunaxa peoples for an understanding of what religion is and what religious freedom is. So, let's look then at the ruling by the Supreme Court. And I want to start first by looking at the majority opinion. All right? As I said earlier, in these cases, sometimes there can be slight differences of opinion among some of the justices in the Supreme Court, and we see that in this case. So there is a majority opinion and a minority opinion, which together comprise the ruling on this particular case. For the majority ruling on this case, it was 7 out of the 9 justices that formed the majority opinion. And you can move to the next. Oh, you're there. Great. In the majority ruling, the justices argued that there was no violation of religious freedom in this particular case. They said there is no violation of religious freedom because, on the one hand, there is no hindrance to the freedom to believe, and on the other hand, they said there is no hindrance to the possibility of manifesting that belief. So in this sense, then, the argument by the Ktunaxa peoples falls outside of the purview of Section 2A, according to the majority opinion. Move to the next slide. So let's take a look at why it was the case that the majority made this argument that it did. Well, one way of arguing to say this fell out of the realm of Section 2A, outside of the purview of an idea of religious freedom, according to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. For one, the majority made a distinction between what, on the one hand, it called belief, and on the other hand, it called the object of belief. And you can see this in the quotation on the screen that I'll read. The majority said, the state's duty under Section 2A is not to protect the object of beliefs or the spiritual focal point of worship, such as grizzly bear spirit. Rather, the state's duty is to protect everyone's freedom to hold such beliefs and to manifest them in worship and practice, or by teaching and dissemination. So they introduce this idea of a distinction between belief on the one hand and an object of belief on the other. And their argument was to say that Section 2A of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects the freedom to believe, but it does not protect the object of that belief. So according to the majority, the Ktunaxa peoples were trying to make an argument to protect the object of their belief and the possibility of manifesting the belief and not protect the belief and the manifestation of that belief. All right? So I think we see in this statement, right, an indication of religion as being at heart or fundamentally belief, something which is more of an internal phenomenon within the individual. That said, it can be a belief which is manifest in certain practices, but those practices are not fundamental to what we're talking about, right? Belief is sort of primary. One might manifest that belief through certain activities and practices, but it's a manifestation of something which is already held internally. Another reason that the majority argued against the Ktunaxa's claim was because of a distinction, and we can switch here, that the Supreme Court made between what it saw as an understanding of the communal dimension of religion. So let me read you another excerpt. They said, the difficulty with this argument, the Ktunaxa's argument, is that the communal aspect of the claim is also confined to the scope of freedom of religion under Section 2A. It is true that freedom of religion under Section 2A has a communal aspect, but the communal aspects of freedom of religion do not and should not extend Section 2A's protection beyond the freedom to have beliefs and the freedom to manifest them. So what does this mean? I think what we see here is that the idea of communal manifestation and practice is only ever a manifestation, again, of something more fundamental, which is that individual aspect of belief. So belief can be reduced to individually held statements and propositions and understandings, but the communal aspect then is nothing more than the aggregate of those individual beliefs, right? The communal dimension is only a summation, an adding up, an aggregate of individual understandings, individuals that then come together to join together. The communal aspect is not greater than the sum of its parts, right? It's not the whole that precedes the parts. It's not the whole that might form or constitute those parts, right? The communal dimension is not something which itself gives rise to, forms, cultivates, constitutes even belief understandings at the individual level. So in this sense, according to this idea, right, of community or communal aspect of belief as being an aggregate of individual belief, then there is no protection under Section 2A for a larger way of life, a larger way of being that might be linked to a sacred space, and that would imply that religion is something more simply than internally held belief. So we see that in the majority's response, right, an articulation of what religion is, certainly connected with individual belief, an understanding of religion then as not bound to a particular place, right, or land, because fundamentally it's something internally held, and also an indication then that those practices are not as fundamental as the belief itself. And I think here again we might see a certain flavor, a certain form of Protestant Christianity. So let's move now to the minority ruling in this case. Like I said, the minority opinion, 2 out of the 9 justices held a slightly different view. According to the minority ruling, there was disagreement with the majority's opinion. The minority argued that there is a need for a more expansive notion of religious freedom than was given by the majority opinion. And in this respect, the minority opinion, I think, agreed more closely with the arguments that the Ktunaxa peoples were making in the case. One of the arguments by the minority for what would be implied in a more expansive understanding of religious freedom was the idea that the connection in that relation is important, and the meaning that flows from that connection. So the minority ruling said, for example, and I'll read you another quotation, the development of a ski resort would desecrate Gatmuk and cause Brizziger spirit to leave, thus severing the Ktunaxa's connection to the land. As a result, the Ktunaxa would no longer receive spiritual guidance and assistance from Grizzly Bear Spirit, while songs, rituals, and ceremonies associated with Grizzly Bear Spirit would become meaningless. So you see emphasis here on the idea of that connection being severed that the Ktunaxa were emphasizing. Okay? A recognition on the part of the minority ruling that the Ktunaxa people would lose that dimension of an understood spiritual guidance through their relation with this land and the spirit that lived there, and the recognition that this renders then those understandings meaningless for the Ktunaxa people. Religion becomes for them, the practices become for them empty gestures and hollow rituals. Another aspect of the argument for the minority ruling with respect to religious freedom pertained then to an emphasis on the significance of the understandings and practices for the Ktunaxa peoples. So the minority ruling said, where a person's religious belief no longer provides spiritual fulfillment, or where the person's religious practice no longer allows him or her to foster a connection with the divine, that person cannot act in accordance with his or her religious beliefs or practices, as they have lost all religious significance. Though an individual could still publicly profess a certain belief or act out a given ritual, it would hold no religious significance for him or her. So you can see even with the italics, right, in this quotation, an emphasis not so much on the belief side, but on the religious side, and the minority calling for a more expansive understanding of that to entail not simply belief itself, but also the preservation of the significance of that belief. So here I think we see the minority opinion recognizing the way in which the significance of that understanding itself needs to be there, because that significance in part constitutes the understanding, the belief. And it shifts also that emphasis to the connection with the land and to the divine, and therefore away from the emphasis on belief. One other aspect about the minority ruling's pushback against the majority opinion. And this relates to an argument about the need for sort of differential treatment among groups. So in the minority opinion, it was said, the principle of state neutrality requires that the state not favor or hinder one religion over the other. To ensure that all religions are afforded the same level of protection under Section 2A, courts must be alive to the unique characteristics of each religion and the distinct ways in which state action may interfere with that religion's belief or practices. So, protecting religious freedom, according to the minority opinion, entails differing treatment between different groups. So, state neutrality needs to be understood in a slightly different way to the way in which the majority opinion was understanding state neutrality. You might think here of a difference between what could be called equal treatment and treatment as equals. The majority of opinions understanding neutrality would be equal treatment, a sort of blind notion of justice, right, that acts and treats various individuals or various groups all in the exact same way. An idea of treatment as equals would say that if one is to treat individuals or groups as equals, that may actually necessitate differential treatment to those different groups and individuals because of the particular issues at play or challenges that those groups face. So, in summary, I think in the opinion of the minority ruling, one sees that rejection of the majority, which wants to reduce the understanding of religion and religious freedom to belief and the manifestation of those beliefs, to an emphasis on the importance of protecting the significance and the meaning of those understandings and those practices. And then, in the case of the Ktunaxa, then, of course, that means protecting this particular land. Now, however much the minority really pushed back against the majority, what is very interesting, I think, is that the minority ruling ultimately still agreed with majority opinion. So in the end, however much it wanted to call for a more expansive understanding of religion and religious freedom, in the end it agreed that the Supreme Court should rule on this case in favor of the developer and against the Ktunaxa peoples. Why is that the case? Well, according to the minority opinion, they said, if the court were to side with the Ktunaxa peoples against the developer, the court would be giving the Ktunaxa peoples an effective veto on the decision whether or not to allow development in this region. This area, Ktunaxa, is what in Canada is referred to Crown land. Crown land means any land which is privately owned and is therefore held in public trust and public good. Okay. Now the land is also under dispute because it was land which was not officially ceded by the Ktunaxa peoples, but until that claim is settled, it remains Crown land. So the minority opinion argued to rule in favor of the Ktunaxa peoples would be to give them veto power over what is done with this Crown land, with this public land. And the government of the province of British Columbia is charged with overseeing public use of Crown land, overseeing that land to ensure it is used in the public interest. So in a sense, the minority opinion was arguing that to rule in favor of the Ktunaxa peoples would be to give them effective property rights over this place, over Ktunaxa, right? Property rights being understood as the right to exclusion, the right to exclusive use of this land, to have sole authority over decisions regarding the use of that land. So that veto would be, in effect, a property right to the area. You can move to the next slide. So in this respect, this is what the minority opinion said. They said, a religious group would therefore be able to regulate the use of a vast expanse of public land so that it conforms to its religious belief. It seems implicit from the minister's reasons, and the minister in charge of Crown land in the province of British Columbia, from the minister's reasons that permitting a religious group to dictate the use of a large tract of land according to its religious belief and excluding the public from using the land in a way contrary to this belief would undermine the objectives of administering Crown land and disposing of it in the public interest. It can be inferred that the minister found that granting the Ktunaxa such a power of exclusion would not fulfill his statutory mandate. Rather, it would significantly compromise, if not negate, these objectives. So there is an understanding by the minority opinion to certain limits then to religious freedom. However much it wanted to expand that understanding, it still wants to hold limits. And the limits that it draws, I think, are based on understandings in liberal forms of political thought, the idea of not causing harm to others, right? In this case, not infringing on the rights of others, and more specifically here, not infringing on the property right of use of this land for other purposes. So land is approached from the angle of property rights. But this view of land, I want to suggest, is itself religion-like. It operates, shall we say, at the same level of religious understandings and religious outlooks. To get at what I'm trying to argue here, let's take a look again at the Ktunaxa's view of land. For the Ktunaxa people, their understanding of land emerges from the creation story in their tradition. So they understand that they as a people were created in that territory, that they were put in that territory by the Creator to be there for a reason, to be keepers of this land. Now this creation story is significant for the Ktunaxa peoples because it gives them an obligation to care for the land, to respect it, and to respect all of the living things within that land. So this creation story forms for them a certain law, if you will, a certain moral code that regulates behavior for the Ktunaxa peoples. And that is a law of sustenance, an idea that land gives the resources that are necessary to survive, but that in turn, then humans and the Ktunaxa peoples have to uphold this relation with the Creator to protect it and not to overuse it. So this understanding of land, according to the Ktunaxa people, I want to say, is precisely not an understanding of ownership of land. Okay? And I think that the minority ruling in this case, however much it, on the one hand, seeks to expand the notion of religious freedom, still misses the fact that it is operating with an understanding of land according to a notion of private property and according to a notion of ownership, as opposed to an idea of stewardship of that land. So the view of land that the minority opinion is operating with, right, is a distinct view from the Ktunaxa people's view, because it sees land as an object to be owned, an object to be manipulated and disposed of as humans deem fit, one that I think flows from a certain desire for control over the physical world. And by that nature, as I said, it's wrapped up in what I think is a religion-like view of the world and the place of humans in it. Importantly, also, this view of land removes from the equation this issue as falling under the purview of religion and religious freedom. And in fact, I think there's a dual movement that's going on here. Because on the one hand, with this view of land, it removes the issue, like the case brought forward by the Ktunaxa peoples, from the realm of religion and religious freedom. But on the other hand, it renders it or relegates it to being an issue of politics because it concerns land understood as property. Now, to understand better, I think what I mean about this sort of dual movement, I want to turn to a thinker very well known in the tradition of liberal political thought, John Locke. I have two final quotations for you here, but they capture this idea of a dual movement going on here. Here's how John Locke spoke about religion and about politics. So, first of all, his idea of politics. This is what he said in a letter concerning toleration. He said, "The Commonwealth seems to me to be a society of men constituted only for the procuring, preserving, and advancing of their own civil interests. Civil interests I call life, liberty, indolence of body, and the possession of outward things such as money, land, houses, furniture, and the like." So politics, according to Locke, concerns civil interests, and what falls under civil interests, among other things, land, property, right? With that definition of politics, then, Locke provides a definition of religion. Here's an example. He says, "A church, then I take to be a voluntary society of men, joining themselves together of their own accord, in order to the public worshiping of God, in such a manner as they judge acceptable to him, and effectual to the salvation of their souls." Here I think we do see in Locke's thought, then, an indication of religion closely connected to the idea of belief, internally held. Religion becomes a voluntary society, a voluntary association, right? The coming together of individually held belief in a sort of summation or aggregation to form a communal practice understood as the sum of its parts. But this idea, then, of religion closely connected with belief is the very flip side of the understanding of politics as concerning civil interests and land among them. By saying that politics pertains to things like property, right? By implication, religion pertains to an understanding of belief individually held, and vice versa. An understanding of religion as individually held belief, by extension, implies that politics pertains to these civil interests of things like money and land. So there's a dual movement here of a creation, if you will, constitution of what religion is on the one hand, and on the other hand, a constitution of what politics is and what falls under the domain of politics, the idea of land as property. So, having said that, I've tried to draw your attention to what I see as two key claims at play in the ruling by the Supreme Court. And these claims, I think, are interrelated. On one hand, as I said, the Supreme Court characterizes religion in a certain way, closely connected with the idea of individual belief. We see this reflected in the majority opinion. And on the other hand, I think we see the Supreme Court holding a certain religion-like view of land as property. We see this reflected in the minority opinion. And this religion-like view of land puts the Ktunaxa peoples in a bind, because it sets the framework within which the Ktunaxa people have to struggle to make claims about the nature of their spirituality. They have to, they seek to argue for a notion of religion that's fundamentally tied to land, not tied to internalized belief, an idea of spirituality, that has a lived connection with the divine and practices that constitute that connection, and something that can't be separated from place. And by implication, that they're arguing exactly opposite to this idea of land as ownership. So there is a dual relation here also in the Ktunaxa people's understanding. If religion entails this lived connection, if it entails practices tied to land that cultivate and form these understandings, then by implication, land is sacred and precisely something that can't be owned and be manipulated by the mere will of human beings. It is something that can only be stewarded. So the Ktunaxa people are caught in a system that renders their claim as a claim not pertaining to religion, and by extension that their claims not protected under the provisions for religious freedom in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because religion is not belief, and because their claim to religious freedom is reduced to an issue of property rights. And I think this raises these important questions about the secular state's claim to being a neutral guardian of religious freedom, because we see the particularity of its claims as constituting what the nature of religion is and what the nature of religious freedom is. And that rests, as I said, on a certain religious-like understanding, to use other words, if you will, a certain social imaginary of the world and the place of humans within it. So I'll end there, and I'm certainly willing to respond to questions.
To begin with, thank you very much for your lecture. I'll switch the mic shortly. But I had a couple of questions from the audience who submitted them with their silence. So I'll quickly begin with those questions, and afterwards we'll turn over to you. But yeah, very interesting approach to lecture. First, I just want to say, and I'm curious what would happen if you applied this to some other religions, such as Judaism or Islam in Israel or Saudi Arabia. Just on my own, something I noticed. What if you took that to one of their voting sites and said, let's build a resort here, instead of, because you can still worship around that resort, but that's a different matter. So, to begin with, to just find the question. I have one coming in from YouTube already, so we can start off with that and then we'll continue with the audience's prior questions. So, regarding states agencies protecting ecosystem services, a conservation agency. Ecosystem services consist of provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural services. The most important cultural ecosystem service is perhaps spiritual. If a state agency would act in a way to protect cultural ecosystem services of a natural area, a lake, a forest, or a mountain, would it breach secularity by doing so in the name of spirituality?
Okay, can I ask you to read that once more?
Of course.
Because I want to make sure I'm understanding.
The essence of the question, if I gather it correctly, is whether if a state agency, such as an ecosystem conservation agency, is to protect ecosystem services of a natural area, so a lake, and a forest, or a mountain, does it breach secularity by doing so? If it's protecting it in the name of culture or spirituality? If I got that correctly.
Okay, it's tough taking questions from the audience that's not here because I can't ask a follow-up on the question. So hopefully I've understood what is being asked here. If I'm understanding the question, I think the nature of this question is to say, is there a form of conservation or a form of protection of certain places or certain natural resources that couldn't violate an understanding of secularity? I think that's the sort of the thrust here of this question, hopefully. Okay. Let me respond to that, hoping that is the nature of the question. I really think this comes down to the question of is there a neutral understanding of what land is? Yeah? So is there an understanding of land which is not somehow bound to the particularity of perspective, right? The particularity of particular traditions or groups? And I want to make the claim, at least with respect to this case and with respect to the argument that is advanced by the minority ruling in the case, that the idea of land as property, right, as something that can be owned, is itself not a neutral claim. All right, it's not a claim that somehow stands above and beyond the particularity of traditions. And in this case, as I was trying to point out, with giving you some examples of someone like John Locke and his understanding of the difference between religion and politics as distinct spheres, right? This is operating with a view of land as something that can be sort of held and controlled, an object that can be manipulated and disposed of at will. And I think that's a particular understanding. So I think in this case, we don't see a neutral understanding of land that is at play, because the understanding of land that the minority opinion is operating with is just as particular as the understanding that the Ktunaxa peoples are working with. So if a perspective on what land is fundamentally, what it really is something that can't be arbitrated in a neutral manner, right, which has no link to particular assumptions or understandings, this then raises questions about what we mean about secularity and the nature of a secular state, a secular democratic state. And I think there it becomes a much more complicated and difficult issue having to navigate this diversity of perspectives and difference of perspectives, in this case about the nature of land. So that is a much more tricky sort of conversation. Yeah.
I hope that answered that question. I'm sure they can always ask a follow-up through the YouTube comments again if she ever received a response. If not, I would like to move on to one of the questions from the audience which was submitted before the lecture started, and I'll just reframe it in terms of what you've told us so far. So, as far as I understand, the court ruled against the Ktunaxa people that their location was not innately sacred and wasn't protected under Canadian law. I'm not aware of the reactions of the Ktunaxa people, but what the question asked is, can secularization result in more extremism? So in terms of this case, I'm curious, besides the broader question, how the Ktunaxa people reacted and how the indigenous people in general have reacted to this ruling. Did it result in more extremism, and more broadly, does secularization result in more extremism?
Okay. Certainly not in this case. There were no instances of violence or the likes as a response to this ruling of the Supreme Court. So that hasn't occurred. Now there are broader issues of contestation around Indigenous rights in Canada that do at times lead to forms of protest and blockades and the likes. But so far as I'm aware, in this particular instance, no, that certainly hasn't led to any forms of violence. On the question more broadly, can secularism lead to forms of extremism, I think was the term in the question. I think we can see instances in the world where this happens, although I would want to have a larger question about why that is the case. And I think part of what's wrapped up here is the way in which we can see forms of secularism as potentially being very exclusionary, right? And forms of secularism that can leave minority traditions, minority religious communities, feeling as though they are sort of exposed and vulnerable and at the whim of majority understandings within the countries that they find themselves in. Yes, I think that frustrations at times due to certain forms of secularism, can and have resulted in violent measures. But I think this necessitates, right, that we have this question of revisiting, rethinking the nature of secularism to see whether or not some of the ways in which secularism has been structured in certain countries around the world may not be able and capable to respond to the sorts of challenges, certainly the challenges of diversity that we see in a globalized world today.
To follow up, you said that in this particular case there was no extremist reaction, but in general there has been a trend. There is another comment from YouTube which is quite interesting, which relates to it. I'll just read it out in full, and I'm curious about how you react. So Christianity has done everything to destroy the culture and self-determination of native peoples, as the last residential school run by the church to destroy the culture was only closed in 1996. Canadian courts never ruled in favour of Aboriginal people. The government and police, RCOP, and attack terrorists the natives every day today.
Can you read this a bit slower?
Of course.
Yeah.
Essentially, the Canadian courts never ruled in favour of the people. The government is against them, but the police is against them. Their last residential school was closed in 1996. And so they don't actually comment, but they are clearly very aggravated at the state of Indigenous rights in Canada in general. And so there's this online activism going. So is this true? Does the Canadian courts typically rule against Indigenous spirituality? Does it give them freedom, or is it like this claim?
Well, certainly the relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada is one that is in need of much more improvement. There's a legacy and a history that the country needs to confront, in still many ways, and needs to work through, and by no means is it there yet. I think over recent years in the country, these sorts of issues are coming onto the public agenda, are entering into the public conversation to a greater degree. So I think that at least presents some hope, for the future, of the possibility of the country on the whole reconciling with the Indigenous peoples within it, and also reconciling with and working through the legacy of what were some very troubling and disturbing activities, on the part of the government and other actors, including some of the churches with the residential school system that was mentioned in that question. In regards to this particular court case, the Government of Canada actually announced at the beginning of this year that it was earmarking a large sum of money, around 16 million Canadian dollars, that it was going to be put together with another roughly 5 million raised by some different private entities and associations, and that this money would go towards turning Ktunaxa then into a conservation area. So the government has promised this money to assist in turning it into a conservation area, and I think that's actually evidence, at least in this instance, of the government, probably disagreeing with the ruling of the Supreme Court. So set up the conservation area and also to compensate the developer for some of the expenses, I guess, associated with this long process. Yeah. So there is, in that sense, development in this whole issue that has emerged this year. Yeah.
So despite previous track records, there is some effort to progress.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm just going to turn to the room, because so far I've been going off pre-comments and YouTube. But I'm wondering if anyone here has a question, not necessarily related to the lecture, but if you do, that'd be great. So if you just raise your hand and speak up, and I'll repeat your question for you.
Yeah, mine kind of is a strange question, but in general, like, on a legal standpoint, what's the difference between the people of Canada wanting to invoke religious freedom in order to stop the building of this ski resort, and Christians in the US invoking religious freedom against gay marriage, against abortion and other rights? And why do we kind of expect in the US case the government to protect not the religious freedom but the other people, but in Canada, in the sense we have this bias towards protecting the religious freedom? I don't know if it's clear.
Okay, so you're asking what is the difference between the claim on the part of the Ktunaxa peoples in this case, right, to religious freedom, in comparison to some of the claims that are made in, for example, the United States among certain groups, which are, they claim, if I understand correctly, right, you're saying the claim to freedom of religion, I suppose, in reaction to, right, some of the changes in legislation to do with issues like abortion and gay marriage.
To make it more clear, for example, the Indiana baker who refused to prepare cakes for gay marriages, where he says, I invoke my religion freedom in religion because it goes against my beliefs.
Yeah, good question. And I think there is a significant difference here. Okay, and I think this cuts to the heart of what I was trying to say about the understanding of religion that the Supreme Court was working with in this case. I think what you see in some of the instances that you've referred to is an appeal to freedom of religion, or perhaps freedom of conscience more broadly. But that appeal is being made still within the terms of this understanding of religion as connected with belief, right? Because these are claims about the freedom of belief, the freedom of conscience, and therefore not having to undertake certain actions or practices within the context of the changing legal structure in the country. Yeah, so it's a seeking of a space, if you will, of protection from some of the prevailing laws. And I think that's very much still operating with the understanding of religion as primarily about internally held belief, right? Because it's a protection of that internally held belief by making the argument that one should be forced to engage in certain activities. The sort of claim that's being made by the Ktunaxa peoples is, as I was saying throughout my talk, is something which is very different from that. They're trying to say in their appeal to that freedom of religion clause, precisely that religion should not be only understood in the sense of belief, it should be reduced to belief. Right? So this idea of practices, right? The idea of the communal dimension of their spirituality, which is not that aggregate, that's some of the parts, right? It's something which is more than the parts, something maybe that precedes the parts, right? And in that respect, it shapes the understanding of individuals, right? Individuals are embedded within that larger communal practice, right? Which teaches them, which cultivates, which forms their outlooks and their understandings. And also their claims about the importance of place, right? The importance of land. And that for them, an idea of religious freedom cannot be separated from land. these different aspects that they are arguing for, I think, are very different from what you see in the arguments and the examples that you've referred to. So I think, yes, we see a very distinct characterization and definition of what religious freedom is in each of those instances. Yeah. But helps with respect to your question? Yeah. Okay.
All right. So somewhat related to that, and we had another question come in, which also talked a little bit about values of indigenous peoples versus Western societies. So the question is from Maria Schwartz. Is it even possible for courts to rule solely within existing legal rules in a way that preserves the values of indigenous communities?
Okay, I'm by no means here a legal scholar. Okay, I come at this from a slightly other angle, so I can't, in that sense, comment on the intricacies of the Canadian legal system. But I think in this particular instance, in the minority ruling, right, I think there was space there for an alternative ruling. And the space, I think, that was opened up, that wasn't pursued further by the Supreme Court, was the recognition on the part of the minority opinion of the idea that state neutrality, or maybe we have to sort of put this in inverted commas, but that state neutrality vis-a-vis religious freedom requires some differential treatment, right? Remember, I made that distinction between equal treatment, the idea of blind justice, if you think of that statue of Lady Justice, with the scales in her hand and the blindfold, right? That is treatment of every group, every individual in the exact same way. Another understanding of justice, right? Another understanding of equality would be to say that different groups, different individuals have different needs, different challenges, and so to treat everyone equally actually means that different measures have to be implemented for different groups. And I think in this sense, right, there was an opening in this court case where the Supreme Court could have said, along with the minority ruling was pointing to say that here's an instance of a minority religious group within the country, which, because of the unique nature of their spirituality, of their cosmology, right, necessitates a different treatment, a different response than might be necessitated if this would have involved, some other groups.
But more broadly, in terms of indigenous versus Western society across the world, if I also look at Latin America and you've the rainforest there with indigenous groups opposing that, does it work on a global level, not just in Canada? Can they coexist within Western legal courts systems?
Well, yeah, I think there are major challenges, and there may in fact be sort of fundamental differences, tensions, or clash. Again, going back to this particular instance, right, this idea of land that the minority ruling is operating with, I think this is a fundamental difference. And if the Canadian judicial system is premised on a notion of land, understood in the sense of property rights, I think we're getting at something here, right, which is so fundamental, right, that perhaps there is a difference of understanding, which can't be bridged. One has to go sort of with one or the other, right? Do we understand land as something more than something that is simply to be owned? Is land something to be stewarded because it is understood as sacred? And I think that issue cuts to the very heart of this court case, and is something that would have to be drawn to the surface, right, to rethink the ruling in this case.
All right, thank you. Is there any more questions from our live audience? Nina?
It's in essence kind of where do you draw the boundaries between the secular
I would want to make the argument that it might be more productive to think about the idea of secularity from a different starting point. Okay? So as opposed to starting with the idea that we have religion on one hand and secularism on the other, okay? And in that sense, secularism is an ism, as therefore non-religion. I'm not sure that always is the best place to start with these conversations, okay? I wonder if it's more productive to start from a position which looks at, and I'm sort of drawing from a number of thinkers on these questions here and saying this, but to start from another position which says, what might be some of the ideals or some of the values that are understood to underpin the idea of a secular state, okay? And how then can we work from there? So the first question, right, the starting point is no longer what is the hard and fast distinction between religion on the one hand and non-religion, or the secular if we understand that in the sense of non-religion. Yeah? Because I think that question itself has so many problems wrapped up in it. Okay? If we start instead from the position of saying, what are some of the ideals that we might think are integrally wound up and connected with the idea of a secular state, right? And start from there, we can have a very different conversation. Okay? So some thinkers, for example, make this sort of argument. They say, okay, let's not start with this fixation on a distinction between religion and non-religion. Let's start with the idea of the challenge of diversity, the challenge of pluralism. Okay? And if we start from the position of the challenge of diversity and the challenge of pluralism, and we see the idea of secularity as an attempt to try to navigate that challenge, right? Then we can start to think differently about the nature of institutions and what some of the responses might be in any particular case or issue at hand, right? But that might open up the possibility for some differing responses, some more creative responses that might lead in some different, some new directions than if we simply start from a claim that there is a very stark distinction between religion and non-religion, and by implication, say that the boundaries there have to be policed. So that, I think, would be my answer to that question, right? And so, as I was saying, with this idea of differential treatment, right? If one wanted to say, okay, the idea of a secular state is closely connected, say, with an idea like equality, right? By starting from that position, then we can have a conversation about what does equality mean, and what does equal treatment then mean within a secular society, a secular democratic society. And from that starting point, with an example like this case that the Ktunaxa peoples bring to the surface, we might come to the conclusion that there is need for a more expansive understanding of this provision of religious freedom to respond to the sorts of claims that they're making. Yeah. So I think there, moving away from starting with that stark distinction, starts the conversation from a different position. You might also recognize that this supposed distinction between religion and non-religion is more complicated. It's potentially more blurred. Yeah? And in that respect, we might think of other forms of language as a way to put on the same plane, so-called religious traditions and non-religious traditions. And there are scholars that use, different forms of terminology to try to do that, and refer to one at the very end of my talk, which is an idea used by one particular philosopher from Canada who talks about the idea of social imaginary. And his idea there is to use that as a term which levels the playing field between religion and non-religion, to say that whether one is religious or non-religious, one always operates out of, or sees the world always acts out of a form of an imaginary which gives meaning to the world and allows one to understand opposed to necessarily something that can be simply proved. Yeah? And this is my point about perspectives on the nature of land. Yeah? If we see land as something which is sacred to be stewarded, as opposed to land as something to be owned, right? These are the sorts of social imaginaries operating at a very fundamental level that have implications then for one's perspective on the world and the sorts of political and legal decisions that are made.
I wonder what would happen if you were to solve early dispersion about its social imaginaries. The framing of the words sounds quite troubling at best. If you were going to go to a Protestant and talk about their social imaginaries versus a secular person. But beyond that, I will just take one final question from the crowd, if that's all right with you, and then we'll end it here. So if anyone has any questions, please do raise your hand and ask away. If there's no one, then I think we'll end it here. And I want to thank you kindly again for your lecture very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks very much for having me.
Usually we would hand over our traditional gifts to speakers of a bottle of wine and SIB-themed opener, but sadly because of COVID I can't hand them off to you directly, so I'll do that too. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, and thank you everyone here in the hall for coming, and thank you everyone for watching along at home. We had some more comments and interesting contributions from our online audience, if you guys had a good experience, including someone who suggested us to get more knowledge from someone who works on the ground in Canada, providing his email as well. Maybe we can bring you two in contact in the future. But now I just want to say, for what we've got upcoming, next week, Monday, we have another somewhat related lecture more on the topic of fundamentalism, particularly religious extremism and radicalism, which is a very different approach from indigenous spirituality, but it'd be great if you could all be there. It'll be online. It's a lecture titled The Rise of Us in Africa, but the speakers are both more inclined to talk about the reasons behind people being drawn to more extreme religious beliefs and, I guess, social imaginaries. But yeah, so please be there next week. Be there for the social as well afterwards if you're a SIB member. We're doing online escape rooms, so that'll be fun. And yeah, check out our website, check out our Facebook, and see what we've got coming up. Thank you all.